So in the new 3.1 release for the Quad Cortex, they put in a new amp, the Fender Deluxe 64 Vintage. And I've been using that now for a couple weeks, and it's a really great amp. And I've had some interactions with some of the folks in the comments about, is it better than the Lonestar? I've made no secret that the Mesa Lonestar is one of my favorite amps on the Quad Cortex overall, especially as kind of a clean tone, pedal platform, that kind of thing. And so I figured, let's go ahead and just kind of compare them head to head and see how they sound. So what I've done here is I created a preset. I started from my Lonestar rig preset, and what I did is I stripped out a lot of things and then just added in the 64 Vintage so we can switch back and forth. And we're going to focus on 4 kind of tones. One is just a pure clean. The second one is kind of a bluesy low gain tone using OD1. The third is a more driven tone where we're pushing the amp models a little more to see what kind of drive they can give us. And the last one is what I would consider a lead tone for me, which is very kind of stacked gain. So a compressor into a gain, into a gain, into the amp. I tend to stack the gains like that to give kind of a big, warm kind of sound without having to use a heavily driven amp. So let's go ahead and jump in and see how they sound. So you can see I've got the scene set up, those 4 tones across left to right, and then obviously the lower ones are the Lonestar, the upper ones are the 64. And the way I've got the preset set up is we've got a compressor up front that we're going to use just for the lead tone. I've got my Archer icon. Again, we're going to use this for the lead tone. We've got a Nobel OD1. We'll use that for kind of the low gain bluesy tone as well as the lead tone. We've got our Lonestar clean 100 watt normal. I've got the bass pulled back a good amount because the Lonestar can get a little boomy, pushing the mids and treble. I'm keeping the EQ in normal mode. Presence pushed a little bit, pushing the master, and the gain's at about 4. For the Deluxe 64 Vintage, I've got the volume, at least for the clean tones, at about 3. I'm pulling back the treble a little bit. Bass is at 4.4, which is the default setting. I've got the input on high. I'm leaving it in vibrato mode. And then I've got both of those running into a dual IR. This is one of my favorite combinations. These are from Amalgam. You can download them on the Amalgam website for free. I'll put the link in the description. But I'm using the Fender 2x12 G12 mix and the Fender BFSR EAV12 mix. And then on the back end, I've got a little bit of plate reverb and a little bit of analog delay. I've turned the mix down a little bit. We're trying to hear the amps, but I don't like a purely dry tone, so I got to have a little bit of ambience on the end. So let's go ahead and hear how they sound. We'll start with the Lonestar. One thing I want to point out is if you look at the CPU usage, I think the 64 Vintage is using a little more CPU than the Lonestar, which is interesting because the Lonestar has way more controls. And I'm starting to notice that a little bit on the Quad Cortex. Some of the new stuff coming in, either from the plugins or the new releases, I think they're enhancing a lot of the processing that goes on for some of these models and whatnot, and it's churning up more CPU. So hopefully we're getting higher quality tones for that, but I'm definitely seeing a trend, whether it's from the plugins or this new 64, that they're churning up more CPU. Let's go ahead and hear how the Lonestar sounds on the clean. I'm using my Fender Strat, as you can see, and I'm on the neck pickup. So just nice tone. Again, one of my favorite tones on the Quad Cortex. And here's the Fender. So right away, the Fender, I think, actually has a little more gain on it, even though I've got the gain set lower. I think there's a little more availability for kind of pushing it into overdrive than there is on the Lonestar clean. I think that's because the Lonestar is built as a 2-channel amp. It's got a clean channel and it's got a drive channel. The other thing I noticed is the Fender, I think, just has a little more top end to it. So when we're on the Lonestar, Here's the 64. There's just a little more sizzle on the top end. Now, with the Lonestar, you can get a little bit more of that if you change this EQ setting over here and you push it up to like thick. So one thing with the Lonestar, I think overall the Lonestar has a little more controls. You've got gain and master, you've got a mid control, you've got a presence, and you have this EQ setting whether it's normal, thick, or thicker. So I think we could probably get closer to that Fender tone from the Lonestar, but let's not get into option paralysis. Let's keep it kind of straight ahead. But overall, I think a little more top end from the Fender. And a little more grit, maybe even. Let's go ahead and move on to using the ODR1. So I've got the ODR1, not a lot of drive. I got it on 4. I'm pulling back the spectrum just a little bit and pushing the level. So we're pushing the amps a little bit. So here's the Lonestar. Here's the Fender. Again, it sounds like the Fender has a little more edge to it, a little more gain. You know, we're pushing it with the ODR1, and I think you're getting more grit. So let's go ahead and move on to, let's push the amps and see how much drive we can get out of the amps themselves. So this one for the Lonestar, I'm pushing the gain to 8.5. Again, the Lonestar clean channel is pretty clean, and you got to push it quite a bit to get some gain. I am giving a little more bass just to kind of keep the gain from getting too harsh. Go to the Fender. And here, I've only got the gain at 7 because the Fender has a little more gain on tap. I didn't want to overdo it. But you can hear the gain on the Fender, I think because you don't have a separate master volume from gain, I think it has a little more top end to it. It's not quite as tight on the low end. We can push the gain a little bit. And let's go ahead and go to the lead. So this one, I'm just stacking overdrives, and this is typically how I build a lead tone out. Got some compression on the front end to smooth out the attack, and then I'm stacking overdrives to kind of create a bigger tone without having to get kind of a real messy overdrive. And here's the Fender. So again, I think the Fender has a little more top-end grit to it. So it's an interesting comparison. They both sound really good. I don't think you can go wrong with either one. It's really just a matter of taste. I think the Lone Star to me seems a little more tame, if that's the right way to say it. I feel like, you know, because it's a clean channel, when you push it, it doesn't get kind of too out of control, where the Fender, if you just really crank it, it's giving you that kind of crank Fender thing, which is a great tone, but it gets a little sloppier, maybe is the way to put it, but in a good way. So I think for the gainier stuff, I'm still liking the Lone Star because it's a little more mellow and controlled, which is kind of more to my taste, but that doesn't mean the Fender sounds bad. On the clean tone, I do think I like the Fender a little bit better. Just because I think it has a little more touch sensitivity to it. And like we talked about with the Lone Star, you probably could get there a little bit by going to the different EQ settings. But the Fender sounds really good. So I don't know that I have like one opinion as to which one's better. I'm still a huge fan of the Lone Star, but this Fender Deluxe 64 Vintage is, you know, one of my favorite amps on the Quad Cortex now. You know, I haven't been a huge fan of the Fender models on the Quad Cortex to date. That's why I think I started looking for other things like the Lone Star, or, you know, looking for some of the Tone King captures from Amalgam that are great sounding clean tones and things like that. But this Vintage 64 model on the Quad Cortex, I think, is a really big step up in that kind of amp, that kind of US clean kind of amp. And if you haven't checked it out yet, I would highly encourage you to do so. As always, this preset, I'll make it available on my Quad Cortex Cloud. You can download it and compare for yourselves. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.